Welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at four concepts. This will be the first of four videos that we're going to have for landscaping. And what I'm going to start out talking about is the creation of a landscape. I'm then going to go and have a video about landscaping textures, how we go in and build the material that we're going to use and paint textures onto the landscape that we've sculpted and built. I'm going to be talking about height maps, which we use when there might be times when you need a specific terrain, not just a made-up terrain. You need to have something that represents a real place on Earth. How we go about using height maps and using them to our advantage. And then the last video I'm going to have is going to talk about foliage painting. And what you see here in this image is an environment that I've sculpted the landscape. I've applied the textures to it, and then what I've done is I've painted all of the foliage that you see, all the rocks, all of the rocks, everything that you see has all been painted on there. And it's a quick and easy way for you to fill in an environment to make it look as realistic as possible. And then, throughout the entire video series, I'm going to be talking about trying to make your environment look as real as possible, how you should go about laying down elements once you start laying them down, how we paint them, how we sculpt them. And I'm going to stress along the way also that you be patient. Somebody once told me that God took millions of years to sculpt the earth. You can't expect to reproduce that in the space of about 15 minutes. So we're going to start slow. We're going to build things up. We're going to actually build mountains and valleys the way it actually happened. It's going to take time. It's going to take layer after layer after layer of building something up, or removing and creating valleys or lake bottoms or river bottoms, things like that. How we go in and carve away the terrain that we've done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video here. When I come back, I'm going to show you how I created this landscape, the landscaping tools, and then we'll move on from there. Okay, we're back. What I'm doing is I'm starting out with a new blank level within my project. I'm still within the same landscape tutorial project. I've just gone up and I went to File, I created a new level, and I've created a new blank level. The reason I am using this is because it has the sky dome in it and it has lighting and everything is already in it, so I don't have to recreate all of that. You can go and use a blank one if you want, but you have to remember you have to add in lighting and atmosphere and all of that good stuff, and it's easier if I just start with that. I'm just going to select this and I'm going to remove it. I don't need that object there anymore. One of the things about landscape that you're going to find out is landscape has its own collision, so you don't have to worry about it. It's a complicated form of collision. You'll be able to run along the ground. I think one of the things you're going to find is, as we go through this, that sometimes the collision in landscape can be a little tricky. Because of, it depends on how you sculpt the terrain. The program does a really good job of trying to match up collision with the shape of your terrain, but sometimes it has a problem because maybe you've got a real deep valley and you run down in there and you either can't get back up, or if you have abrupt changes in height up or down. Sometimes what happens is you get like a little tear in the collision and you'll fall through it or you'll get trapped by it. So it can be kind of difficult. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the landscape tool, how we actually build the landscape, and then I'm going to do some sculpting on it. I'm also going to keep this relatively small, the focus of this relatively small. Terrains can get out of hand in a hurry. They are meant to be large areas of ground, and if I'm just doing a demo, I probably only need maybe the equivalent of a couple of acres worth of land to show you how this works. I don't need to have a couple of square miles. And a couple of square miles would take up a lot of memory, and the textures get out of hand in a hurry. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this fairly small, but I'm going to explain to you how these things work, because they are a little tricky in and of themselves. So what we do when we need to create our landscape, we're going to go up to our Modes tab. up here in the upper left-hand side of our screen, and we're going to select the one that looks like a mountain. It's called landscape. It's easy to spot. And when you do, your tools are going to change. And the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to notice this giant green grid that appears. And I've got this thing sped up so I can get away really quickly. You can see it is immense. That we were down around here with our elements, and you can see just pretty much in all directions you've got probably, I don't know, 30 or 40 acres here of land. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we adjust the size, how the size works, what this green thing obviously is, because it's not landscape yet. We're not done yet. But I do need to talk a little bit about the sizes and how these things work, because it's a little bit different. We've talked a lot about powers of 2, that when you're working on materials and you have textures, your textures need to be a power of 2. That means they need to be like 256 by 256 or 512 by 512 or 1024 by 1024. And so, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, all the way down to 128, 64, 8, 4, 2. Those are all numbers that we're familiar with and we've worked a lot with. Now, when we start working with landscape, now we're into odd numbers. We're into things that are 63 by 63, and it's like, why would it be 63 by 63 when so far I've been dealing with square numbers divisible by 2, like 64 by 64? What is going on, and why is it that my resolution is got a resolution of 505? What is going on, and what does that mean? So I'm going to explain everything that you see over here, and we're going to go through and figure this out. All right, so first thing we're looking at here is we've got the ability to either create a new landscape, which is what we're doing, or we have the ability to import from a file. Now that's called a height map, and I'm going to do a separate video on that. I'm just going to concentrate on how to create a new landscape here. So look for the video on height maps if you want to use one of those to do what you want to do. Then we have a spot underneath that for the material, and we don't have a material yet because we're going to build that also in a separate video. That'll be the next video that I do. We'll talk about it. It's different than a regular material. It's not, you can't use a regular material. You have to use a landscape material, and so it has to be built a certain way. So we're gonna come back and we're gonna take a look at that separately. Then we have down in here our locations. By default, it's going to go at 0, 0, 0, and then it's going to raise up on the z-axis about 100 units. And there's a reason why it doesn't put it at 0, 0, 0 in your world, why it's raised up 100 units. And that's because there is something in the game that you have not seen and not really been aware of, and it's called the kill zone. And basically, if you had been in a first or third person game level and you were working on something and you ran off the border, let's say you ran to the edge of that thing and jumped off, you would fall until you reached a predetermined position in the world called the kill zone, and then you would die. And I think it's like minus 21,000 units or something like that is where it's preset. That when you add in a landscape, it comes in with, it basically raises up the kill zone. And so if you're in here and you're sculpting, and let's say you decided to like to sculpt out a little valley or a little river bottom because you want your player to forge through this little river bottom, they have to actually go through the water and come up the other side. And you start sculpting this thing downwards. If you're not aware that there is a kill zone there, or if you start out with everything at 0, 0, 0, and you start sculpting down, as soon as you step down into this little valley, you might very well encounter that kill zone, and then your player dies. And you're not going to know why it's happening because you don't really know what a kill zone is, and you haven't had anything to do with that yet. So what they do is because the addition of a landscape raises the kill zone up relatively high, what they do is they start this up so you can actually sculpt down without interfering with the kill zone. The kill zone is only there as a quick way to restart a game. That if you step off the edge and you fall to your death, you don't want to fall for 30 seconds or for a minute and a half, something like that. You want it to end fairly quickly so you can get back and respawn and continue on. So that's why there is a kill zone in there, and it's associated with the landscape. So it comes in at 100 on the Z height. The rotation, it's not rotated as 0, 0, 0. You can. And one of the things that you're going to find is that a lot of times you're building a mountain range, and you're using a specific image, which is a height map, and like I said, we'll show you that in a separate video. You would like to have a small mountain that stands all by itself, you can create a second one of these, and then put a height map on it to create a particular mountain, and then you can texture it, and then you can rotate it around. You can flip it, you can aim it at the camera, you can do all kinds of things with it. So that's why that we do have the ability to rotate in a landscape instead of keeping it all square to the world. The scale is at 100 by 100 by 100. We do not change the scale. If you would like to have a bigger terrain, then you're going to create a larger landscape here in just a second when we start getting into the section sizes and the overall resolution. That's how we create larger terrains. If you take one of these landscapes, and it's going to become an asset. As soon as I create it, it's going to be an asset on my scene. If I just go in and start scaling it up or down, it's going to mess with the textures. I'm going to be creating a texture to go on it, and I'm already going to have trouble getting the tiling correct, so my grass looks like grass and rock looks like rock, and all of those things look like they're supposed to, without having my world or my landscape be scaled up or scaled down. That's going to play with what I'm trying to do. So when we need a landscape, we're going to set the sizes, and then we're going to leave it at that. We're not actually going to scale it up or down. Now the next section underneath that says section size, and it's got quads, and this is where the odd numbers are. 7 by 7, 15 by 15. You notice everything is one off of square, or a power of 2. It's not 16 by 16, it's actually 15 by 15, or it's not 32 by 32, or 64, or 128, or 256. They're all one number off. And a lot of times people say, well, where did that go? Why has that happened? And it has to do with the way Unreal looks at the addition of these quads that you see running across here. Now, if you count those things, it's 4 and 4, so we got 8 quads across there. So when you're looking at this thing and you would think, well, why isn't it then 8 by 8 or 64 by 64? Why is it 7 by 7 or 63 by 63? And at this particular point, it has to do with vertices. So if you look at this thing up here, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 9 vertices up here. Okay? So if I got 9 vertices, that gives me 8 quads running across there. So you always have one more vert than you have quads because of the way you add those things up. So when you go in here and you look at this thing and you say it's 63 by 63, what that is the number of sections across. 64, however, by 64 would be the number of verts. So if I have 63 quads across and 63 quads down, and basically that's what's happening. If you look at each one of those squares, you'll notice that they are cut up into much smaller grids. That's what's going on. That's where your 63 is coming in. And what it is if you look at that and you count the number of squares going across, you're going to have 64 vertices across there, but that only gives you 63 quads. It's 64 vertices from that point to that point. And if there's 64 across on the verts, that means there's only 63 quads in there. So that's why you've got that. If you set this at 7 by 7, you're going to have 7 of those little squares across there, but you're going to have 8 sets of vertices running across each of those little divisions. So that's why these numbers are a little bit off. So keep that in mind when you're doing it. It's one of those things where, you know, once it's explained to you, at that point you've pretty well got a handle on it. And actually, once it's explained to you, it's really only a matter of like, I wonder why that's 63 by 63 and not 64 by 64. And once it's explained to you, you're like, oh, okay, well, I don't really think about it from there on. It doesn't really affect me. I know when I first started creating landscapes, I was always bothered by why are the numbers off? And the explanation was kind of oh, okay, that makes sense. Now, you also have the ability for sections, and I'm going to pull this over so we can read that a little bit. Sections per component. This is a component, and it's the number of sections. It's 1 by 1. We have the number of components, 8 by 8, and then the overall resolution, 505, is preset. Let me give you a tip on this. When you're creating a landscape, especially when you're first starting out, we're going to be using the defaults. You're going to see if I change this from 63 by 63 to 7 by 7, I get a much smaller section here, which is really all I want on this one. I'm probably just going to stick with 7 by 7 just so I can paint a fairly small area on this one. And you'll notice my sections change, my number of components didn't change, but my overall resolution changed. UE will automatically come in here and adjust all of these things to match what you need. Now, if you would like to have a little finer resolution, you can always go in and raise the resolution. Now, if I raise the resolution on this one up, I get a little bit more. And you see I typed in 100, but I only get 99, because again, it's 100 vertices across, but it's 99 quads. And that's probably really all I need to do, but you don't even need to do that. If you want to leave it at what it was, which was 57, I think it was, or 55, whatever the number was, that's going to be fine too. We're going to go in and paint it. Now, when we paint our terrain, the number of quads that you see here are going to determine the amount of sculpting that you can do, because like with everything else in 3D, objects are moved based upon when you're moving or changing the shape of something, you're moving vertices, or you're moving polygons, or you're moving the edges, which are the little lines. So the more of those divisions you have, the finer the detail can be on your sculpting. So keep that in mind. If you're looking for something that's fairly accurate, if we start using height maps, you're going to see we're going to need to be a little bit more accurate than this, but I'm going to be sculpting this on my own, and this is going to be just fine. So I'm going to leave it at the settings that are predetermined in here, but just so you know, 2 by 2 sections basically just doubles the size of that, which I don't need to have, and 1 by 1 is going to work on that one. If I go in and change the number of components, okay, again, all it does is it adds more little sections around there, which I don't need. That's just changing everything that I do. So I'm just going to leave everything the way we see right here. And then finally it says total components 64, because we're always dealing with 8 by 8 in this one. So think of it that way. 8 by 8 is 64, and that's what we got. All right, so those are my basic sizes. I'm just going to do this little small area because I'm going to try to just render out a still image. I don't really need to have a world I'm going to run in for the purposes of this particular demonstration. Excuse me. So once I've got that thing sized the way I want, I'm just going to come down here. I'm going to click Create, and what it does is it then converts over and changes to a terrain. Right? And also you'll notice if you move your mouse around on it, this little thing is happening, and I'll explain kind of what that is here in just a second. So I've got down here, I've got my player start. Now, if you decide at this point to go and do something else, if I decide to play this one, watch what happens. Whoa, I died. Okay, now why did I die? Well, I died because that player start right there. Remember, my terrain started up 100 units. So my player is, which is what this guy is right here, is breaking the plane. He's breaking the plane. So what happens is that when you take something and you say, break the plane on this one, what it does is it acts as if the terrain's not there at all. So I start out below level of that, and there's nothing to keep me from falling. So what you'll have to do is you need to make sure that you pull this thing up to where you are completely above the ground. And then even more so, depending upon what you're doing, this is, I believe, a third-person game. Yeah. So just so it's just slightly above with the snap-on, you should be okay. And you can see I can run around on this thing. It's a fairly solid piece of terrain. You'll also notice the shadows on the ground. It looks like the grid is still there. And the reason that it's showing that grid there has to do with that little red line of copy up there in the left-hand corner of my screen. My lighting needs to be rebuilt. I'm not going to do it because that takes time, and I don't have anything down there to rebuild. I don't even have a material on it yet. So I'm just going to go ahead and escape from that, and we'll go back here, and we're going to start looking at the other tools that are in here, and that problem that you see down there, which really isn't a problem, will go away as soon as I rebuild my lighting at the end of it. All right, so I'm going to go back over here, back to my landscape tab, and now we need to talk about what happens once you already have a terrain in there, what this thing is and what's going on, and how we can use the tools that are in here. Now, there are a lot of tools that are in here for sculpting. Like I said at the very beginning of this thing, we have to treat this the way nature treats mountains. It takes millions of years to build a mountain up. It takes millions of years to tear a mountain down. You have to be careful not to try to do too much at any one time. You really need to take your time and model this thing slowly, to work on it slowly, to build layers up and to tear layers down a little bit at a time, and just kind of get the feel of what's happening. So let's look at that tool, and let's talk about the basic sculpting tools of what we have and what they do, so we can take a look at it. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up and change this to unlit so we can actually see what's happening. I think it'll be a little bit better. You'll notice my lines go away when I do that. That's because it's not trying to represent that. Okay, so let's talk about what this thing is and what's going on right here. So I have 3 tabs over here on my landscape. The first one is Manage. Manage is what I've already done. And you see, if I go in there and I can now click on an orange box, and I can do something on that. I can select sections of my object, or I can do other things to it. It's basically just it literally is a management tool. It just allows me to go in and select a particular block if I wanted to do something different to it. And you can see there's not really a whole lot I've got other than selecting it, so I'm not really going to do anything other than that. Then I have Sculpt, which is where we actually go and start building mountains up or tearing down valleys. And then we have Paint, and the Paint is the next one we're going to do, next video, that involves painting the landscape on. All right, so when I go and I have my Sculpt tool selected, I have 3 of these menus down here, and these are really important because this contains everything that you're going to need to sculpt a realistic looking environment. First thing, I've got the Sculpt tools, and these are the tools that I have for creating the particular terrains. There's a smooth, a flatten, a ramp. There's 2 different types of erosion. One of them is wind erosion. The other one is hydro or water erosion. There's noise, which will allow me to go in and make an area kind of bumpy. There's retopologize, which will allow me to go in and remove all of that stuff. And then there's a visibility section, because there may be times when you're building a landscape and you need to have a cave, say, that goes down into the ground, or you're trying to put an underground bunker in that you have to reach it by going through the surface of the terrain. Remember, there's a collision on that terrain, and I can't get through it. If I paint a hole in the terrain, then I have a hole in which I can climb through or get down through, and then I can put buildings or whatever I want to do underneath it. So we do have the ability to do that. There's also a selection tool, and then there is a copy and paste, which I don't really recommend using because it takes a chunk. When I use one of these, go back to Manage and click on that, I can copy and paste, and I don't really want that. I really want to paint these things, keep this as one big terrain here as I'm doing it. If I need more terrains, I can add more. You can always add more terrain, so I can come back up, deselect that, go back up and do it again, and add a smaller one if I want to build another mountain in there and try and do it that way. And that's a lot of what we do. We are going to treat this terrain basically as generalized landscape. If I need a specific mountain, I'm going to use a height map, and we'll show you how to do that. If I'm looking for a specific type of ridge, I'm going to go get a height map, and I'm going to do that. This is just going to be generic. I'm going to put in some basic mountains back over in here just so I have some hills in the distance, and then I'm going to have a little flattened area, and then I'm going to have another little layer down below. I try to build my terrains so they are stepped. So they kind of have a back area back here that's going to represent hills in the distance. And then I'm going to have an area that's kind of flat in between there that's raised up. It's kind of like a little plateau. And then I'm going to have another area down below that's going to have some more detail put in it. I like to see little ridges. I like to see areas where the rock has been is coming through, where you've had grass and gravel, and then you can see rock where the little hill has broken away and things like that. I'm trying to build this thing up realistically as I do that. So my Sculpt tools are going to allow me to do that. They do pretty much what you think they would do. If I select the Smooth tool and I come over here and I start building up some mountains over and through here, if I get something that's too high and I would like to have a flat top on it, then I can come back over here and I can select Flatten, and what it'll do is it'll go over and it'll flatten it back out. Just the top of it. If I want a ramp, I'll have an area that's tall and an area that's low. If I use the ramp tool, it'll actually create a ramp from the lower height to the upper height. Erosion, we'll show you the erosion on that one, and noise. These 3 are the ones that really allow you to go in and build mountains and to make things look like they're supposed to. The world's not perfectly flat. I get down here and I look and I go, well, that world is pretty flat here. There's not really a whole lot going on. The Earth isn't like that. There's very few very flat places. It's usually raised up or down. And so we're going to be using all those tools to our advantage. Okay, then we also have some brush settings, and you've got 3 different choices here. The circle is kind of a default. In fact, you'll see there's really only 3 of them here. It's a circle, an alpha, and a pattern. You can create an alpha channel. You can go into Photoshop and create an image if you want like a custom, maybe you want a real jagged brush rather than this smooth rounded donut looking thing. You can go into Photoshop and create an alpha channel, and then you can bring it in and apply it to that, and you can do it. Or you can create a pattern. Maybe you're looking for a particular noise pattern. The one that's in here is too smooth and wavy. You want something a little bit more jagged. You can create a pattern in Photoshop and export it out and bring it in and do it. But for the most part, I really just use the circle brush. I don't think I've ever gone back and done anything else because I get everything I need to do out of this one. It's round, but I've got control over the size of it. And then I have some different types of fall off. There's a smooth fall off. There's a linear fall off. There's a spherical. This makes it look like a little blob. And then there's tip, which can make you can do like mesas. If you look in Arizona, where you've got these things going on that the mountains are flat on top, and they've got these little sculpted sides. We can go in and create things like that. And I'm going to show you a little bit about what each one of those things do here. So let me pause here. All right, so there's my different fall offs, and we'll give you kind of a demonstration of that. Now we've got brush size. I have brush fall off. What you're looking at is you are looking at the inner ring is the brush size. The outer ring is the fall off. The fall off is just giving me a soft edge around the outside of that. And again, if I change this to something else, it's going to look the same here. But if you look at that little fuzzy area, the little colored area that you see on there, depending upon what you select over there in terms of your fall off, that's going to change. So if I go to linear, okay, it looks pretty much the same, I guess, because it's about the same size. Spherical, you notice it gets a little bit bigger because it's going to give me more of a blobby look. And then if I go in here and say tip, it's probably going to be a little tighter to that ring right there because it's going to give me more of a hard edge up around the surface of that. So I'm going to keep this at smooth for right now, and that's going to kind of give me the look that I want. I also have tool strength. The brush size, you can just adjust it up or down. The same thing with any of those things. You can adjust those things so you've got, you can change the way that works. You also have tool strength. The tool strength goes from 0 to 1. That just determines whether or not you're painting this big old ring right away or whether you're doing the other thing. You also have, you can raise or you can lower using the flatten mode because you do have the ability to flatten something out, and you can get it all set up that way. You can use a slope flatten. You can pick your value for apply. Most of those things I just kind of keep the way that they are. I don't really have to change anything in there. I'm going to be using the brush size, the brush fall off, and my strength a lot. The other tip I'm going to give you is to work fairly small. I could go in and set that brush to be this big, and I could raise up a whole mountain all at once. But that's really not the way it's done. You really have to build this stuff up slowly, and work and paint and adjust and do those kinds of things. And I'll probably stick for the size of this, and I'll probably stick in about maybe the 50 or 50, the 500, excuse me, or so range, 400, something like that. That would probably work good. My brush fall off, I'm just going to leave it about a 0.35 or a 0.37, somewhere in that range. And my total strength, I'm going to keep this down to maybe about 0.4. Because I don't want to go nuts and I don't want to do this. You're going to see, if you left click and hold, you're going to shoot a giant column up out of the ground. So you need to be really careful when you're doing that. If I go in and say, let's just click and hold and see what happens if I can get this thing to work. You can see what happens if you just left click and hold. Okay, you're gonna get that thing rising up out of there. You need to be in the sculpt tool for that to work. Once you've done your sculpting, I'm just gonna left click a bunch of times. I'm just moving and clicking. I think sometimes students forget that they need to take things right to the edge. That just because you're dealing with a flat square doesn't mean you don't take care of the edges. I can raise that edge back up here, and it'll look like there's actually more of a mountains behind mountains, even though there's a hard edge on the back side of that thing. And that looks pretty good, I think, for what I'm doing. One of the things I'll also do is I will test out the size that I'm working on. So what I'll do is I'll go up here and play, and just to get a sense of how big those things are. And you can see you can run up to a certain point. There is a limit on the angle that the player can go on, and I think I might want those to be just a little bit bigger. So I'm going to go through and the same thing. I click a lot, and I'm just interested in moving the mouse around and raising this thing up, and try to get these things as high as without. I don't want to look like a camel, and I want to make sure that no two mountains are exactly the same, and that everything is. I don't want everything to be too uniform. I do need to have a little bit of variation on that. If you go nuts and you want to flatten something out, this is where you can come back and you can say, well, let's smooth that out, and it'll actually literally kind of collapse those things down. Or I can say, I don't want to do the ramp because, well, I'll do a ramp so you can see. That'll take and create this little sloping area. It'll come down like that. I can go in and do some erosion. If you don't set your tool strength a little bit lower on erosion, it's going to take out your mountains right away. But this is wind erosion, and so you can see the way that it kind of knocks down the elements that you're doing. If you go in and use the hydro erosion simulates water running off the top of a hill. So basically what it'll do is it'll create these little canyons on that. Don't want to do too much of this because I still kind of need to have. You can see I'm getting a little bit of a valley right through there. And I'm getting a little bit of a gray area right in through here that you can see. And it's sort of creating these little valleys that kind of run down between those peaks up there, which is kind of good. If you get a dark area that you see like right there in the middle of the screen, what you want to be careful about is that sometimes what it'll do is it'll create like a little dip right there. If I get down really close to it, I don't want to go too much below ground level because I'm going to actually put something else in there. So I need to make sure that that's kind of not as too severe. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over here and go back to, I'll take my noise, we'll put a little bit of noise. And it's hard to see, but I've got it pretty gentle here. What it'll do is it kind of makes things bumpy, and it takes something that's perfectly flat and gives it a little bit of raised up. Okay, and I'm going to go back and lift that up back there just a little bit more. A little bit more stuff going on in the background. Just click. Nothing more fun than watching somebody else do this. Maybe a little more right back there would be fun. All right. So I've got a little bit of that going on. We'll test it out again to see if that's a little closer to what I want. That's a little bit better. All right. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the size of my brush. So I've got a little bit smaller area to work with. And I have a little bit of a plateau. It's kind of hard to see. I've got a little bit of a plateau right here. This is raised up a little bit. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and let's take this down maybe to about 1/3. And I want to go in and put a little bit of stuff in through here. And I also want to raise this up, and I'm trying to create, in essence, I want a little ridge along here. This is going to become rock. I want to see grass and stuff up here, or dirt, and I want to see some rock edges right along the edge of this thing. So I'm going to kind of lift this up a little bit so it's a little bit more bumpy and wavy. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to use the smooth, and I'm going to see if I can't smooth out the front of this thing just a little bit. I really want to see a little bit of an edge, so I'll take smooth, and I'm also going to do flatten, and you'll see flatten will kind of create this little edge going along there, so I can get kind of the little effect that I'm looking for. All right. And that's basically how you create these things. You can go and do nuts. I would recommend that you almost always, like I'm just going to do this thing, I'm going to render it from this direction, so I don't really need to worry about what's behind me. A lot of times when you're building the world, like if you're doing the world for your layout for the game level that you're doing for the modular world, and you're going to use a landscape in that one, it's going to have to be large. And what I'll do is, like Phoenix itself is a giant valley. So you've got mountains or hills all the way around the valley, and you get a sense that you're actually down inside of something. And when we start building environments, and we want to have the appearance of a world outside of our environment, then we want to make sure that there's at least a terrain that's visible from every angle. So if you're working with a larger terrain or a landscape and you're going to put something in the middle of it, I would recommend you paint mountains all the way around. You don't really want to be able to look out at any time and see a perfectly flat horizon, because the Earth isn't like that. It's all bumpy and hilly, and you can make these as small as you want or as big as you want. If you want to make them the Alps or the Rockies, you can do that. If you want to make them look like rolling hills, you can do that. You just really don't ever want to look out and see that flat terrain out there. That just is not going to do really what you need. Now there are ways of hiding that. There is a fog that we can use. It'll basically put a distance fog in, so that this will kind of vanish into the mist as you go out there. But this is a relatively small environment, and I'd have to have fog right on top of everything to be able to obscure that. So if I'm dealing with a larger terrain, then it's going to be a little bit easier to work with. So I'm going to stop this video right here. I think you get a sense of how the tools work. Work slowly, build areas up. If you need to, if you're painting something and you want to remove it, that's going to be Shift. You're going to use Shift and left click to take areas out. That's an undo. If you are painting, it's just the left click to paint things up. You want to keep your tool strength low. You want to keep your brush fall off kind of soft, and your brush sizes, keep them fairly small, and then you can add in all kinds of details. And the last thing I'm going to add into this thing is, when you're sculpting a terrain or a landscape, keep in mind that the detail work we're going to add in is what's going to make this thing come alive. All I'm really looking for is the structure on which to paint realistic looking textures, and even that won't be the end all. My textures, when you look at the textures on this, you're going to go, well, that doesn't look very good, and it won't look very good, because you don't ever see a terrain that's just made up of flat textures. So most of the terrains we deal with, like the one I showed you at the beginning here, have all kinds of elements added into them. There's rocks, there's trees, there's bushes, there's flowers, there's grasses, there's all kinds of things. That's what's going to make this final thing come alive, not the modeling itself. It's just a generalized frame. And even the textures that go on it are going to specifically decide what areas are to be rock and what areas are to be dirt and what areas are to be grass. And I'm going to go in and blend those together, because there usually aren't any hard definitions between those three elements. Grass blends into gravel and dirt blends into rocks. And you can't grow grass on a rock. And we're going to show you how, when we go back and paint the assets in, we can actually set it so we don't paint in certain areas. So this is just step one, and all you really need is a generalized terrain that looks something like this, and you're ready to move on to the next step. So in the next video here, we're going to go in and we're going to create our landscape materials and start painting our little terrain, so we get this thing all set up and ready to go.